Good afternoon, everyone. This is Councilmember Tui with our Safe Community Committee meeting for August 23rd, 2023. I'm here with Councilmembers Arlingo, and we're going to be looking at two items today, noise regulations as well as our police matrix study update. So with that, we'll jump right in with the noise regulations, and we're welcome Megan Monroe to walk us through that. Hello, Megan.
Okay. So I know you have some questions about the scope of noise ordinance, so I want to just kind of go over our noise ordinance as it exists right now, understanding that it is currently in rewrite with an outside law firm. And I think that's, we're still waiting for a couple more changes on that one. So our current noise ordinance, there's a baseline model noise ordinance that comes from the Washington State Department of Ecology that all jurisdictions must have as a bare minimum. And if they don't have a noise ordinance, that is what applies to them. City of Everett has its own noise control ordinance, and we do have the elements of that minimum standard from Department of Ecology. Anything that Department of Ecology puts in there as a minimum standard, we cannot change. But for instance, the Department of Ecology's minimum standard doesn't include anything about public disturbance noise, which would be the kind of noise where we call because your neighbors are having a party at 11 o'clock at night. None of that is addressed. And so our ordinance has things in addition to what is in that minimum noise ordinance from Washington State DOE. Ours is a very standard noise ordinance, looks very much like they do in every other municipality or county around here. We are actually right now shifting the administration of the noise ordinance from my position, which is the occupational safety and health manager for the city, down to our planning and permitting department, because that's actually where a lot of these things come in. So both our code enforcement officers for some types of noise complaints, and also our building inspectors for construction-related noise complaints, as well as requests for construction-related noise variances would then go through planning and permitting. So that's part of what we're addressing in this rewrite. The noise ordinance has roughly two categories, and one would be those kinds of environmental noise, and those would all be enforced by either code enforcement or by our construction inspectors. And then we have the criminal noise sources, which are more your public disturbance and public nuisance noises. We recently, in the last rewrite, we switched from a decibel-based reading for the criminal ones to plainly audible by our officers when they're on the scene. And so that's what we're trying to do in a noise ordinance as it is right now, is just make that division of responsibility more clear, so that we've got the right people responding to the right types of noise complaints.
So just so that I can understand, because we have several complaints about streetcar racing, that people can hear when they're laying in bed. And so would that be, where would that fall?
So we have three parts of the noise ordinance that are related to motor vehicle noise. And all three of them are directly from that minimum standard from the Department of Ecology. Two of them have to do with how cars are built. So they're aimed at the manufacturer. There's nothing there for us. Basically, you cannot intentionally build a car to be 140 decibels is what they're telling the manufacturers. The part of it that we do enforce is the specific prohibitions part, and there are 3 line items in there, and these are all enforced by Everett Police Department, and they have to do with having a working muffler system, not modified, not modifying any of your car parts in order to make them louder, so doing conversions to put a different kind of, bypass your muffler or anything like that. And then tire noise, which is intentionally created by the operator, so intentionally chirping your tires and things like that. So I think the kinds of noise you're talking about are addressed in that specific section. The difficulty is observing them and ownership of the vehicle versus the operator of the vehicle.
Does that mean any citation would go to the owner rather than the operator?
Well, Dan Templeman, Police Chief. typically, and these are the challenges, right? This is one of the issues as to why enforcing these laws is so difficult. Typically, it does go to the operator. It depends on the offense. As Megan was saying, there's one offense, and this is really nuanced, but that is enforced by law enforcement. That is the act of creating the noise, and then one is operating a vehicle that has that equipment. So in both of those instances, we would issue that infraction or criminal citation to the operator, but there is a possibility that if you could track it back, to who installed it, that they may be responsible as well. But it is one of the enforcement challenges that we run into very often.
Yeah, it sounds like noise is a particular enforcement challenge. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Fosse, do you have any questions on the noise? Okay. Anything else?
No, I think I was just observationally, and from what I hear from my constituents, it's a very small number of vehicles, though dramatically modified for extremely loud sounds, often repeated backfires, which are disturbing enough. So I guess one thing I would say, I know this is difficult stuff to enforce and to administer, and I would say that there's probably a 90-10, a Pareto chart kind of a thing there that could be done where a few of these that are just ridiculously loud and also hopefully then easier to identify and or are specifically designed to create the backfires and things that are especially disturbing that I think we'd probably get best community support if that was something we could focus on.
So I just remembered another email that I'd received about noise from a construction site that they felt was beyond the level that was acceptable. And I don't know, I mean, obviously you have to go there and measure it somehow. And so I'm just curious how we want to tell our constituents to handle that.
So for construction noise, we have a list that our ordinance is kind of hard to find everything in, but there's a list of exempted noises, and there's one list that's our noise that are exempt at all time. And there's another list that is exempt from 7 a.m. until 10 p.m. Noise from temporary construction sites is on that list. So between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. on weekdays, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 a.m., you're allowed to make, on a permitted temporary construction site, there's no decibel level that we
Okay.
read for. So
Okay.
any level of noise is allowed. And also 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on weekends and state-recognized holidays.
Okay?
Outside of those hours, the noise cannot leave the site. So construction could be happening if you had very quiet construction site. Generally speaking, it's backup alarms. We have a variance process where contractors can reach out and they can request a variance from the noise ordinance. Our criteria is very strict for that. We will issue a variance, meaning we will allow night construction work if our traffic department has said that streets have to be closed for safety, therefore work must be done at night. Or if we're working around a fish window and tides for any work that's related generally down at the port. Other than that, we do not issue variances for night construction.
Okay.
I think part of the reason we are talking about this too was noise related to manufacturing. So we've got some
That's right.
manufacturing property that's not too far from residential areas, and sometimes the trees mask the noise and sometimes it doesn't. And so I don't know if there's anything Megan, that you could speak to around that.
I can. So in that circumstance, if I were to receive that call, the first question that I would ask is, what kind of business is it? Because we do have some specific types of business, again, that are exempt at all times. So for example, when we receive complaints about railroad noise, we specifically are excluded from any action for anything that's under the Federal Railway Administration. That is their rule, and it's in our ordinance as well. We simply do not have jurisdiction over the railroads. Another item, and I think I know what you're referring to, is aircraft engine testing is specifically exempted on that list of things that are allowed between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. airplane engine testing is a line item that is allowed in the ordinance, and that is from the minimum standard from DOE, from Department of Ecology. So that is not an item that we can change in our noise ordinance.
Yeah, seem to remember that it was a manufacturing company that was making constant noise, and I'd have to look that up, but I can send it to you and we can chat about that.
So in that case, we do have noise limits based on the receiving property. So if it's a zoned residential receiving property, and we do own the equipment to go out and to do noise measurement.
Okay.
And those levels change again 10 o'clock at night. So during the day, it's up to 55 decibels at the receiving property, and it's down to 45 decibels. However, noise monitoring is can be a delicate process because you have to factor out any background noises. So usually we go and handle those by a site visit. We try to figure out if there is a specific source or if it's all operation-based.
Okay.
Sometimes it's one piece of equipment, sometimes it's a roll-up door that just needs to be closed during operations. We try to work that out with the business.
Okay, great.
But yeah,
Well,
please
I'll
do send that to
refer
me.
that to, yeah, and we'll
Yep.
get back to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, any other questions? And when, so it's currently in rewrite, when do you propose that might come back to council with the rewrite?
We were waiting for the attorney to come back from maternity leave,
Okay,
so I'm going to say 6 months.
okay, we won't hold our breath, okay. All right, great, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Really
Yvette.
appreciate that, Megan. Okay, now we have our Chief Templeman, who's here tonight to give us an update on the police matrix study and anything else.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Council Vice President Tui. And yes, I am going to give a brief update on the status of the Matrix Police Assessment Study. And I think it's important that before I go into where we're at today and how we've broken down that report and how we're looking at it and what our plans are in terms of implementing some of the recommendations that were included as part of that plan, that I at least give a little bit of background for those that are watching or for council members that may not have been around in either 2014 when this first started to be discussed, or 2020, 21 when council actually authorized the assessment. So by way of just a little bit of background, and I won't go into great detail, but this assessment for police was first brought up as a proposal in 2014, and it was part of what was called the SDAT process at the time, or the Structural Deficit Advisory Team, and that was a team of intra-departmental members that were convened to look at the structural deficit, which is an issue that is still plaguing, the city today, but hopefully we'll be able to address that in the future. And this committee was charged with really looking at several different departments and operations throughout the city and trying to identify recommendations in areas where costs could be cut to reduce the financial impact of some of those services. And so the team looked at every department essentially in the city. I was part of this team. Ultimately, there were a few departments that were either deemed very complex or very large, and that this team of department directors that have other jobs during the day weren't able to have the capacity to really dig into some of these departments. And police and fire were both included as two of those departments that maybe an outside assessment would be a better way to review their operations. So that happened in about 2014, 2015. The fire department actually was the first department that actually underwent an outside assessment, and that report was done. And after administration and fire department received that report, a lot of things happened. Certainly in police, we started to hit our real extreme staffing challenges started after that time. And it was decided not to move forward with an assessment at that particular time. And fast forward to about 2020, 2021, and the topic was brought up again at city council level, and that's when the city council authorized $125,000 to complete this assessment for the police department. And the primary scope of the assessment was to look at police department operations, our management structure, our staffing, and come up with recommendations on how we can continue to provide the quality services that we were providing at the time, but in the most cost-effective manner. And that was really the overarching goals of the assessment. The RFP was drafted with the assistance of our purchasing department, finance department, council president, Stonecipher, and then the chair of the Public Safety Committee, which was Councilmember Murphy. Were all involved in the drafting of the RFP and identifying the scope of the assessment and provided their input. That came to council in June of '21, and the RFP was ultimately published or posted in that same month. In September of '21, that's when Matrix Consulting was identified as the consultant that would complete the work. And they had extensive experience in conducting law enforcement and public safety assessments. I believe it was over 400 assessments that they'd done for public safety agencies over the previous 40 years. So they were very well versed and experienced in public safety operations. The assessment then got underway in October of 2021, and the RFP outlined 4 phases of work that included council check-ins along the way while that work was being conducted. The first check-in was with the Public Safety Committee on September 14th in 2022, and the report was completed, I think it was October 28th of 2022, and then a full briefing of the report to the entire City Council was in November, early November of 2022. So that kind of gives you just a quick outline of how we got to that point, and we have then the report in our hands at that point, and then the work really begins, which is now what do we do with this report. So that process that Matrix went through to develop the report included a lot of different aspects, included data collection. That took us a couple of months to produce all the data that Matrix was looking for. They were looking for all kinds of different pieces of information, from calls for service to response times to training programs to scheduling, overtime and budget information. And so it did take us some time to put all that information together. They also included community input. I believe they had 5 or 6 community meetings, including one meeting that was done in Spanish. And so it included input from both outside of the department and then internal. Council members, I believe it was both Stonecipher and Murphy at the time, were also interviewed as part of that process. And then, of course, that final report. So when we received that final report, it contained, I believe the number is 62 recommendations. And when you think about that, that sounds like a big number, like, oh my goodness, we have a lot of things we need to work on. But when you really look through and you read the recommendations, many of those recommendations pertain to staffing, and they include things like maintain staffing of X number of personnel in this unit. So we really, when you weed those out, and some of them were duplicative, and had some overlap. So when you really condense those down, what we were able to do with the help of Lieutenant Kevin Fairchild, who was our project manager at the time, and he's continued to be an integral part of implementing this report, was we created a spreadsheet. So we basically broke down all the recommendations, all 62 of them, into a spreadsheet so that we have that available to us. Again, varied recommendations, some complex and others not so complex. Some that are mandatory subjects of bargaining with the union, some that aren't, some that have a budget impact, some that don't. And so obviously all of those factors play into our ability to implement those changes and really how quickly we're able to implement those changes. And some were policy and procedure related, which also, depending on what we're talking about, could also require mandatory bargaining with the union. What we did ultimately was I went through that spreadsheet that we developed and really grouped the recommendations into 4 different buckets right now. And those buckets are scheduling and staffing is one bucket. Public trust and transparency is bucket number 2. Policy and procedure, bucket number 3. And bucket number 4 is other. And there are a few of those that are in there. So now I want to just talk about some of the progress and where we're at today with this. And I have to start by saying that bandwidth is a huge obstacle. And whether I'm talking about the matrix report, or if I have time after we're done to talk about, how we're addressing some of the street level issues that Vice President Tui, you had asked about, it's bandwidth and capacity of our staff. So right now, obviously, we are strained in terms of our personnel. And so the progress is impacted, with studies like this, where we're focusing really on our public safety priorities first and foremost. And then projects like this may be second or third or even fourth in our priority list. So while I'll share some progress that has been made, there's still obviously a lot more work to be done when it comes to this report and implementing some of these recommendations. So under the scheduling and staffing bucket, there were some recommendations. I'm not going to get into any of the COPS grant positions, because that was, handled kind of separately. The matrix didn't really look at those, because those were personnel and recommendations and a grant that was obtained prior to the matrix coming in and conducting their study. But in their study, they recommended 9 additional full-time employees for the police department, 4 non-commissioned or civilian employees, and 5 commissioned positions. Thus far, we have added 2 non-commissioned positions that we felt were really critical to our operations. One in crime analysis, and it had to do with data validation for crime data. It's an area that we needed to beef up, and we needed to make sure that the crime data that we were reporting to WASPIC and reporting statewide was accurate. As we transitioned from our old data reporting system to the New World system a few years ago, the data and the codes, really the officers were now starting to enter in these codes as opposed to record staff. And sometimes the officers were not entering in the most appropriate codes for the offenses. And so, but we didn't have a processor or a staff member that was available to validate and review to make sure that our data was accurate. And so now we have that person. And they're starting with just property crimes, but going to be expanding that to all crimes. So we'll be able to, with confidence, report that crime data on an annual basis. I still think we were very good, but having this check and balance in place is really important. And then the other position that we really need, and honestly we probably could use even more, was another public disclosure person. The public disclosure requests have increased exponentially. When you compared Everett to other jurisdictions, our FTE count per, as it relates to the number of public disclosure requests was much lower than all of our, comparables that we were looking at. And when we transitioned to body-worn cameras several years ago, we never added staff to address that. And you'll see today that every department is adding, 4 or 5 FTEs for that. So we've added 1 public disclosure specialist. So these were 2 of the 4 civilian positions that were recommended in the matrix report, and they're making a difference in helping us today. As far as staffing, one of the recommendations was a redeployment of some of our personnel to address some of the peak call load time and to try to increase our staffing during peak call load and then lower our staffing during periods where there are fewer calls for service. That is something we certainly continue to look at. We have not done any redeployment yet. That is a mandatory subject to bargaining because it will impact contractual minimum crews numbers, during different parts of the day. So it's something that we remain interested in, but at this point we've not done any redeployment of those staff members at this point. We have actually, unrelated to this though, we have added some officers onto night shift in the south end. Those were via the COPS grant, the already approved positions that council had approved us for previous. And so we've added some positions for that. Some of the other ones remain vacant in patrol, but per the recommendation, we've not yet dove real deep into redeploying our existing resources. Scheduling, one of the recommendations from the matrix under the scheduling piece was for the department to continue to review and explore alternate staffing or alternate schedule options. Currently, our patrol officers work 12-hour shifts. I don't know exactly, I can't recite the rotation, but I know that every other weekend they have a Friday, Saturday, Sunday off, and that's the general patrol schedule. But we do have other specialty units. So our, anti-crime team or our violent crime unit or our school resource officers, some work 5-day work weeks, some work 4-day work weeks. Our detectives work 4-day work weeks. So it's varied already. But I think for patrol, if we're able to find at least one other alternate work schedule that works and doesn't create huge minimum crew staffing issues and budgetary impacts, but can improve the quality of life for our officers in terms of time off, we really need to explore that. So that's something that's certainly on our list.
So when they do the 12-hour shift, do they do that 4 days a week?
They do it, and the best way for me to give you an example, they'll do either 2 days
Okay.
in a row or 3 days in a row. So
Okay.
at most, they'll work three
In a row?
12 hours. Now, that doesn't include overtime. And
Right.
we are asking our officers to work a lot of overtime shifts just because we have so many vacancies throughout the organization.
Okay.
So it's possible that
That's
a
their
patrol
base
officer could-
shift
their
would be
base
2 or 3
at most
days.
would be 2 or 3 days. Yes. And then one other, under the scheduling and staffing bucket, one other change that we have made at the time that Matrix was conducting their assessment, our administrative sergeants had been kind of reassigned to some different side duties to include background investigations for one of our administrative sergeants. So that created this void for problem-solving, non-emergent community and neighborhood issues, which is what our administrative sergeants do. We have one north and one south, and they really focus on those calls and those situations that patrol just doesn't have the time to spend to troubleshoot some of those issues because they're going from call to call to call. So our administrative sergeants are really instrumental in bringing resources together and getting creative on how to address some of these lingering community issues. And so we have, since the Matrix report, we've now reassigned our administrative sergeants to full neighborhood and administrative sergeant duties at this point. The trust and transparency bucket, one of the recommendations was that we develop a policy that emphasizes a practice that we've already been engaged in as it relates to internal investigations, and specifically it had to do with drafting and implementation of a written policy that states that the department will complete internal investigations on employees who make the decision to leave employment in the middle of an internal investigation. So some law enforcement agencies, as soon as the employee leaves, if they're in the middle of an internal investigation, which is, an investigation into an employee misconduct of some sort, the department will then stop the investigation because they're no longer an employee, and, they will divert those resources to more pressing tasks. We've never done that. We didn't have a written policy that said we would complete these investigations. Our practice has always been. So we've since updated our policy manual to now explicitly state that if an employee is under active internal investigation and they separate employment on their own, that we will still complete those internal investigations. Community transparency dashboard, another bucket. This is something I'm really proud of, and this is something that we have on our public-facing website. And this is an area where community members can go and look at our use of force data. It includes data on the types of calls that we're using force on, the demographics of the individuals who we're using force on, and like I say, nature of calls, the numbers of uses of force, the type of force that we're using. All that information is available on our public website. But one of the things that I want to do is I want to expand that. So I want to include not only right now it's use of force data, calls for service, arrest information, and ticket and citation data. All that is included on our community transparency dashboard right now. One of the things we'd like to do, and it's part of the recommendation from Matrix as well, is to add the components of pursuit data, traffic pursuit, and citizen complaint data. Now again, bandwidth, this is going to require us to completely revamp our review process for both of these topics that are currently paper process. We're going to have to revamp those to electronic process in order for it to automatically upload to our community transparency dashboard. So as soon as we have the bandwidth to add those two components, it's something we will be doing. Another recommendation that's still in review, but we're looking at it, has to do with early intervention systems. So We currently have a program that we utilize when it comes to employee management. And one of the features it has is what's called EIS, or Early Intervention System. And so this is a tracking system that tracks use of force applications. It tracks citizen complaint information. It tracks all kinds of different personnel management areas. And if you hit a certain threshold, then it alerts our Office of Professional Standards, and then that information then is sent down the chain of command, at least to look at what's causing the alert. Most of the time, it's officers that are engaging in completely proper conduct and following proper policies and procedures, but may have just encountered certain calls or certain individuals where they've had to use force or got into a collision, some of those types of things, minor collisions. So we will look at all of those alerts when they come down and address those. What the recommendation was in Matrix was to take another look at what those topic areas are. Right now, I mentioned collisions, use of force, citizen complaints. There may be others now, such as absenteeism, exposure to traumatic events. Things have changed a lot, in law enforcement over the years. And so their recommendation was, hey, take a second look at this and see if there are other subject areas. So we'll be looking at what some of the other departments that use systems like this, what they're using as their criteria, and maybe considering adding to those. And then for our anti-crime and violent crime units, there was a recommendation to start tracking key performance measures. So start tracking some of the activity of those two units and some of the, because they're doing outstanding work and they are recovering a lot of firearms. They're making a lot of arrests of violent criminals for felony charges. So to start tracking some of that data. And so we have, through our crime analysis unit and working with members and leadership on these two teams, have started tracking some of those metrics and have the ability now to, on demand, although I don't have any at my fingertips here, but be able to produce some of that data if we're asked about it. The third bucket under policy and procedure, this is fairly quick, has to do with updating our policy manual. A recommendation was made to update our policy manual to remove the word citizen from the policy manual and replace it with community member or some other term. And so we've gone through our entire policy and procedure manual. I hope we've gotten them all, but we're changing those up, including names of certain units like our Citizen Volunteers Against Crime. We'll be rebranding that team as well. I mentioned that early intervention system policy review, and then they did recommend, well, one of the recommendations, even though it's not a recommendation, was that we had done a very good job of updating our policy manual as it relates to all the use of force, decertification, pursuit, police tactics, all the changes that were implemented in 2021 at the state level, and had done a very good job of updating our policies to make sure that we were in compliance with all the new state laws that went into effect, and their recommendation was to continue to do that. We're very fortunate in the police department because we have Lacey Offit, who has presented to council before, and she's our legal advisor, and so without her, I don't know that we would have had a comment like this in our report that says, hey, you did a really good job on this. I would hope that we still would, but she really was instrumental in shepherding all those changes through the process. So with that, that's kind of where we're at today. This is a project that will continue to live on probably for quite some time because some of these recommendations are going to be long-term projects if we decide to undertake them and negotiate with the union or make some other organizational changes. But we'll continue to keep it on the forefront, and one of the things we talk about is making sure it's not a document that just collects dust on the shelf, but that we're always kind of looking at it. So I'm happy to answer any questions as it relates to that.
Well, I just really appreciate that you guys have organized it in a way where, in your 4 buckets and are working towards that. I mean, that's great that you've really dug into it and organized it in a way that you guys can get all that done. And I want just an update on how many open positions we have right now.
I think we are at approximately 24 police officer positions, and I believe 4 to 5 non-commissioned positions. I will, because you've asked, you know, we, a couple things, you know, council approved an agreement a few weeks ago that allowed us to assign a lieutenant and an officer up to Northwest Regional Basic Law Enforcement Academy. That's getting started. I think it'll probably kick off later this year, early next year. The state has added these new regional academies throughout the region. One Northwest Washington, one Southwest Washington, and one Southeast Washington. And we had two of our officers, one lieutenant and one officer, that submitted their applications to be part of the leadership cadre of the Northwest Regional. Now, what it means to us is we lose these two bodies, but on the positive side is the state's paying for us to refill those or, backfill those positions, which we're doing. But one of the side benefits we get from having a lieutenant up there who will be they're called the assistant commander, but it's the highest ranking officer running that regional academy. And one of our officers is TAC officers. We get 6 guaranteed positions in every regional class. And that's been one of the biggest challenges for us, is getting people into the academy and having them wait 5 months just to get an academy spot. So by having our 2 personnel, even though it may cause some hardship, but not really, because we're going to be backfilling those positions, having that ability to get officers into the academy like that is going to help us. And so I'm cautiously optimistic by maybe next summer that we'll still have vacancies, but we'll start to see some relief and be able to really be more responsive to community concerns.
Great. And when do they start again?
Well, they're already working on it, so
Okay.
they're gone.
And so their vacancies are part of the 24?
Their vacancies may not be part of the 24.
Okay.
We may be
Okay.
adding those here
Okay.
soon, maybe through budget amendment coming up. So.
Yeah,
But we
okay.
will be being reimbursed for those
Right,
while they're assigned there.
okay.
One or two things, I guess, from the standpoint of we're having some success in getting additional officers, how's retention going? I know that's another, it's the net thing that, of course, we're trying to improve all the time. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, well, retention's challenging. It really is. I mean, we've been so focused on recruiting for all these years. I know that we have, and council has approved some retention incentives over the last couple of years. But retention still continues to be a problem. I think what we're starting to see is a little bit different, a little bit of a shift from officers who may have 25, 30 years on or 30 plus years on who are retiring, although we still have a handful of officers with 30 plus years that are retiring just because of years of service. It's time to retire. And starting to see a little bit of a shift with some of the less tenured officers, moving on, whether it's moving on to a different profession, whether it's moving for family reasons. We get a lot of that, moving to either a different state or to Eastern Washington. And that continues to be a challenge. So I think that as a chief, and I think as a council and as city administration, we need to be paying attention to the retention piece, because we can hire all day long, and if you keep losing them out the back door, you're never going to gain ground. And so I appreciate the question.
And then I was going to commend you for the early intervention program. I know, police work is difficult and stressful and wearing on our officers. And I would hope that if that stress makes it difficult in terms of the practice, that is revealed early on, and they get help, and we keep those officers operating and really well serving their community. So I think that taking a look at that analytically and rigorously on the front end is so much better than on the back end having a problem and seeing the traces in retrospect.
How often do you look back and kind of assess that retention, exit interview data on kind of the reasonings for people moving on?
Yeah, well, we look at it constantly. So anytime an officer is leaving the department, we may not have formal interviews like with myself, but I typically will receive a written document from that employee, and we know the circumstance, right? We're a large department in the sense that we've got a lot of great opportunities and for officers to do and things of that nature, but we're small enough that we know who all of our people are. We know the circumstances as to why they're leaving. And again, the vast majority, right, are leaving either due to years of service and it's time to move on, or family. You know, some sort of a family dynamic is driving that. Now, we do have other reasons that pop up here and there, but those are probably the two most common that I see.
Well, I'm asking because I'm wondering if there's any sort of demographic trends that's explainable in some of those departures. So, for instance, family reasons, are you talking about, you know, now that we have more women in the force, are they leaving it all for those types of family reasons? Or are they like literally people moving out of state? Or is it something where they decide to pursue a different career for their family? Or
It's all of that, but I don't think that, you know, and I'd have to really look at the demographics, but just based on my recollection, sitting here right now, that family dynamic of leaving is typically because one spouse or the other, you know, has family in a certain area, and maybe they want to get back to where their family's at. And as far as, you know, some of our women officers, you know, I don't know that I've seen, you know, many that are leaving for, you know, because there's, let's say, they don't have enough time, you know, they need more time at home or things like that. We are very accommodating when it comes to some of those needs that our diverse workforce has. It doesn't mean we can't be, you know, more accommodating, but we are as accommodating as we can while also recognizing the need to staff, you know, patrol and respond to 911 calls.
thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Any other questions or comments from council? Well, thank you so much, Chief. Appreciate it. I know that I reached out to you earlier this week about some of the, you know, businesses have really been kind of hit hard lately. It seems like, I don't know if it's an uptick or they're just finally reaching out, you know, which could be that too. But anyway, if you wanted to just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I could spend about 5 minutes here just giving a very, very high-level overview and answering any questions that you may have. I'm going to start this one by saying that what I'm going to talk about here, pretty much everything that our business community and our residents are seeing can be tied to drugs, and particularly fentanyl. And so, you know, I will say that fentanyl is different than any drug that I've seen in my 31 years in police work in terms of the impact that it has, and the fact that some of our traditional approaches to addressing people that are you know, suffering from substance abuse disorder as it relates to fentanyl don't work. And a lot of it has to do because of the fact that fentanyl changes the brain, and it does not allow people, I think, to assess risk at the same level that some of the other drugs, including meth and heroin, would allow people to do. So, and of course, detox is extremely difficult off of fentanyl. You get very, very sick. And so this is driving, in my opinion, the vast majority of what we're seeing on our streets. So whether it's downtown businesses or South Everett businesses or residential areas. So I wanted to mention that to give you a little bit of a perspective. I asked our team to provide me with a couple of data points that I think will be very illustrative of the problem that I'm talking about. All of our officers, we were one of the first departments in the county to carry naloxone for all of our officers in their patrol cars and on them. And I asked for some year-to-date information on how many doses of naloxone have we administered year-to-date. And that number, year-to-date from January through the August date, middle of August, was 138 doses, and that involved 110 calls for service for overdose. So we sometimes will give multiple doses in a single incident. So that was an average, according to the team, of 3.3 calls for service for overdoses each week, and an average of two doses per patient. Last year, during the same time period, we had administered through those first 8 months 23 doses on 16 calls for service. So that represents a 500% increase in the number of doses that we've administered this year versus last year, and a 587% increase in the number of calls for service related to overdose. So this is a problem, and this is a challenge, and I know that our community looks at police to solve this problem, and I think police, as I've said before, need to be part of the solution. We are not the solution, and I can't state that strongly enough to our community, that they need to understand that this is going to take a much more holistic approach than just law enforcement. But I do think law enforcement has a critical role in this. So what I want to talk about is just kind of what we're doing now. So, from the law enforcement side, we continue with our co-ed team. We're almost at full staffing there. We're down one social worker and one officer, and I'm hopeful that we'll have that second social worker sometime soon. But that co-ed team is still out there doing the great work that they've been doing for years with outreach and enforcement. They're always willing to help people that are willing to accept that help. But in addition to co-ed, we have instituted some other specialized patrols. And again, bandwidth is key here. We don't have a lot of officers, and so we're asking these same officers that are working patrol on those 12-hour shifts then to come in on their days off and work some of these overtime details to address some of these specific neighborhood issues. And so very briefly, we've got 2 patrols that we run regularly, one in the North Everett part of town and one in the South Everett part of town. They're 2 officer cars, and they work really the areas that have been identified either through data or through community complaints. They're working those areas. And they're really doing mostly enforcement, although they will call in co-ed if they find a situation where it's, they've got somebody that's willing to accept help. But those are going nonstop. We have run this year 11, just in August. We've run 11 in August of those North Everett patrols and 20 in August in South Everett. But what I'm most proud of and excited to share is some of these other emphasis patrols that our department is starting to do that are very creative, they're very innovative. They're really being run by sergeants and the officers. So they're the ones that are saying, hey, on our days off as a crew, let's come in and work this special detail. And so I'll just give you an example of some of the details that we've been running that I think are addressing some of the issues and hopefully will over time that we're seeing. We ran a street racing emphasis in June, so council members are lingo to your point about street racing and noise. We were able to be just a step ahead of these racers every location that they went, and ultimately they left our city. They did come back later, but we had resources available to address that. We've run 2 different parking enforcement emphasis patrols, drug market interdiction patrol operation in August. We've run park emphasis patrols because we're getting a lot of concerns from residents about Clark Park, Wiggums Hollow, J.J. Hill Park, Walter Hall, so a lot of these different parks. So we've had officers coming in on overtime details to work those. And then just most recently, and we've had very good feedback from these retailers, we've worked some anti-theft or retail theft operations with Bartell's, QFC in the North Everett, Lowe's, and Fred Meyer. And we'll continue to run those operations. And so I know this isn't all about arrests and citations, but I know that there are members of our community that don't think that we arrest people or charge people with crimes anymore, and I will share that just during these operations that we've run, we've made 141 arrests, and we have issued an additional 63 citations to people. And so, this may help get some of these individuals into some of those court programs that you heard about last week from the judges that I think are outstanding. And they talked about leverage a little bit, and maybe sometimes some of these individuals need just a little bit of a push to get into some of these programs. And so I hope that with some of the work that we're doing that we're able to give them that little nudge that they need to take that help and be healthy. So I'm, again, available to answer any questions that you may have.
Just going to remark that I thought it's a particularly interesting and effective idea to give the authority to the troops, the on the ground people who know where the problems are. They're more likely on a personal basis to know what the issues are in those neighborhoods and maybe who some of the bad actors or bad types of behavior are. So That is real innovative. Thank you.
So I really appreciate you providing all of that data and that background and emphasizing the importance of our co-ed team and kind of explaining how, the police have a role, but it's a bigger picture. And I know, like, even if we had more co-ed staff, at some point, as many staff as we put there, is there going to be some other deficit that you're seeing that is not, in your opinion, where we would need to target next to help that so it just doesn't keep falling on your plate?
Well, if I think I understand the question correctly, and if I'm off base, you can let me know. But, I think that, to your point about we could have as many co-ed teams and social workers out there as possible, if we don't have sufficient treatment facilities or shelter and housing, those kinds of, job placement and assistance, we can get them into the system and we can help them, but if there's nothing waiting for them when they get out, the risk is really high that we're going to see them again. And so I think that as those systems build up, which I hope they do in the future, that will certainly help reduce that drain in the future. Not sure if that was exactly what you
Yeah,
did.
so I'm wondering if maybe then it would be helpful maybe to have co-ed come in and kind of maybe chat with us, if they're allowed to do that, about where they're kind of seeing, we need to direct people there, because that increase you talked about, that 500%, that is just very exponentially scary for the community. And, the problem is just exacerbated. And so it sounds like at this point, we really need to do something. If it's not, exclusively, finding the funds to hire co-ed teams, if it's something in particular that we really need to target our efforts towards, that would be really, really helpful and useful to know.
You're going to have a jail presentation, I think, tonight, and I won't try not to speak out of turn, but you heard the judges talk last week about, that moment, those potential moments of clear thought and where individuals are at, and if those services were available. And I know that the jail does a great job, and you're going to hear about it tonight, but sometimes when you're there for 3 days or 4 days, that's not long enough to be able to really get the help that you need. And so I think that there may be some opportunities, coming up, and they may cost money, and they may be things that we look to the state for assistance with, but, reimagining how we, look at jails or, some of these, until the other systems can be built up, that just aren't there today, right? Those systems on the other side.
Yeah, I think it would be good to have an update from the co-ed team, and, like you say, maybe there's some, just curious what, on the field, what the resources they feel could really be beneficial, so that we can kind of work towards that.
Typically, we could have, leadership from that side, but, quite often they're out
Yeah.
working in the field, which is where I really want them, but we can certainly provide some sort of an update if we have specific
Okay.
pieces of information that you're looking for.
Okay, we'll work on that. All right, anything else from council members? Well, thank you so much. Very, very helpful, very interesting. And now we're going to end, and our next month, we're going to look at the nuisance properties and code enforcement and our citywide ADA transition plan. So those are the two things on the docket for now. So thank you very much, and with that, we'll close.